Hi everyone, welcome back. Having now illustrated in some greater detail how phonological rules can interact with one another, we can move on to some data from a language isolate from California, which is now unfortunately nearly extinct. The data are taken from Kinstwitz and Kissebert's famous book on generative phonology here. And in this case, we won't be concerning ourselves so much with the ordering of phonological rules as with the analysis of the underlying representations that arise in the forms of morphemes. So again, let's express a procedure for carrying out morphophonemic analysis. What do we want to do in cases when we find that there are multiple kinds of allomorphy present in the data for which we need separate rules? So our first step will always be to try to carry out a morphological analysis when it looks like we can assume there is some morphological structure and we can posit what the form of a morpheme is or what its allomorphs are. We should do that first. And we want to find what the allomorphs are when different stems or different affixes have different forms, make note of those, and then try to develop some hypotheses about underlying representations and establish what the most reasonable phonological rules combined with the best underlying representations would be. And then at the end, make sure that that our rules work as expected and identify any cases in which the rules need to be ordered with respect to one another to ensure that all of the data are generated correctly with the system of rules that we've developed. So here we have a set of 11 verbal forms and a couple of additional forms just to illustrate a couple of other points. So our first step, following step A, the morphological analysis, will be to make a provisional division of forms into morphemes, especially if we see there are no alternations. So we have three different morphosyntactic categories: an imperative, a first singular, and a third singular. And each row corresponds to a different verbal meaning. So given that we have three different morphosyntactic categories, I would begin by thinking that there could be different pieces of morphology added in these different categories. When I look first at the column corresponding to the imperative, I don't see any commonalities in terms of something that I could identify as a prefix or a suffix or infix very easily. So I'll assume here that probably the imperative maybe just corresponds to the verbal root, the inflectable verbal stem. When I look at the first singular forms, on the other hand, there it should be immediately clear to us that there is a morphological commonality among all of these forms. There's always a sequence ni at the beginning of the word. So that leads quite naturally then to the assumption that there is a prefix with the underlying form ni. It's not subject to any phonological rules that create allomorphs, and thus we'll see that prefix. In the third singular, then we have a similar situation in which it looks like there is always a sequence of a glottal stop followed by the vowel u at the beginning of a word. So we have u pasip, u sitva, and so on. But some complications potentially arise here. If you look at the very last form, there the imperative uksup and the third singular form are apparently the same. They're both uksup. So it sort of looks like in the third singular that the imperative form is missing. And one reason why I have put this glottal stop in parentheses here is that if you look through the data in general, you'll notice that there are no vowel initial words. And actually, this isn't true. Glottal stop occurs mostly word initially, but not exclusively word initially. We actually have word internal glottal stops in a couple of forms here in the verbs meaning pick up and pluck at. And the verb meaning point there, as I've already observed, contains the sequence u at the beginning of the imperative form as well. So the reason why I've placed this glottal stop in parentheses is because I wonder here whether or not this glottal stop might be inserted by a phonological rule. Namely, the fact that there are no vowel initial words might show us that it's not allowed to have a word begin with a vowel, and if there is a word that underlyingly begins with a vowel, a glottal stop is perhaps inserted. We'll discuss this problem a little bit more at the end of this exercise. Let's now come to looking for issues of allomorphy. So thus far, we saw for these prefixes ni and u, there doesn't seem to be any allomorphy. So now I'll look at the verbal stems themselves and see what kind of alternations we have found. In the first root, pasip, this remains the same all the time, but already in the second row, I see some different forms. In the imperative, we have the form sitva, but in the first singular form, we have nishitva. In the third singular, then we have sitva again. So in the verb that means steal, we have at least two allomorphs. We have sitva alternating with shitva. An alternation between an alveolar sibilant and a palato-alveolar sibilant. And this same alternation occurs in a couple of other places in the data. Also in number 4, supri, alternating with shupri in the first singular. And in the number 9, we see iksha and niksha, but in the third singular, we have uksa. So there an S occurring. And in 11, we also see uksup alternating with nikshup. So there are several of these cases of, we can basically describe this as an alternation between a coronal sibilant fricative and a palato-alveolar, an alveolar sibilant fricative and a palato-alveolar sibilant fricative. And the context in which it looks like this alternation occurs, so in a couple of cases, in row number 2 and in row number 4, we find the sh immediately following the vowel e, and in the other instances in which we find it occurring, an alternation between S, once again in 8, we have ish, ishkak, nishkak, and uskak. 9, we have iksha, niksha, but uksa. 10, ishriv, nishriv, but usriv, and uksup, nikshup, and uksup. So it looks like the palato-alveolar fricative sh always occurs immediately after a vowel e, as in 2 and 10 in the imperative and the first singular, or there can also be a consonant ka preceding that vowel. So the context in which sh occurs is limited to this context of e with one intervening consonant. And since the sound sa occurs more broadly, it can occur word initially, it can occur after the vowel u. Are there any other contexts in which an S occurs? Probably kind of limited. Here we find it, right, this is what the other data is here for. We also find this sh occurring after a pa here, but not when the vowel is u in this case. And in these other forms, a verb meaning to slice off, we have an S following a K with a vowel a here, but here we have a sh following a P where the preceding vowel is E. So I'm going to adopt the analysis then that the underlying phoneme is an alveolar fricative, which has two allophones, sa and sha occurs in the context of a vowel e with one consonant optionally intervening. So this gives us the S palatalization rule shown in 8. Let's now try to see if to systematically collect patterns of allomorphy. So if we look at rows number 1, 3, 5, and 6, there is no stem allomorphy whatsoever. So row 1 I'm going to systematically establish the underlying representations. Row 1 we always see the form passive for shoot, for the verb shoot. Row, let's see, it was also 3, 5, and 6. There, the form of the stem is always kiefnuk, stoop. And in row 5, we have ifik, and that sequence ifik occurs in all forms of the verb. And similarly, in row 6, aktuv occurs in all 3 verbal forms. Doesn't have any other, the stem doesn't have any other forms, so that must be the underlying representation. No problem. Now, in rows 2 and 4, we don't see any alternations except those which happen because of the sa-sh alternations. So, and there we only find the sh in the first singular form conditioned by the addition of the prefix ni. So row number 2, the underlying form by our analysis of the allophonic relations must be sitva, and the allomorph shitva is derived by the S palatalization rule, and the same applies to row number 4 as well. So in that case, the stem must be, the underlying form of the stem must be sukri. Okay, so that gives us underlying representations for the first 6 stems. When we come to 7 through 11, things suddenly look a bit more complicated. These stems show alternations of a glottal stop with nothing and a vowel and nothing. So notice here, so let's take number 7 as our example. In the imperative, the form is ahar, but in the first singular, it's nihyar. So both the glottal stop and the ah that occur at the beginning of the imperative form are missing in the first singular, and they're also missing in the third singular. Instead, we have ni and u at the beginning of the word instead of ah. And something similar applies in the other forms as well, but because the in the imperative here we have vowels e or u, in either the first singular or the third singular, the same vowel e or u also occurs. So it's really row number 7 which is clearest here, that we're seeing an alternation of a vowel and nothing, because the ah vowel that occurs in the imperative is no longer present in the first singular or the third singular. Let's consider these logical possibilities when we have these types of alternations of segments with nothing. So whenever we see cases of segments alternating with the absence of a segment, there are always 2 logical possibilities. We're either looking at epenthesis or deletion, insertion or deletion. So the 2 possibilities then would be that since we find the glottal stop in those forms in the imperative, we could believe that a glottal stop would be inserted in imperatives, On the other hand, if we believe that the glottal stop is underlying, that is, that the imperatives are showing us the underlying form here, then we would need to think that the glottal stop is being deleted in the first singular and the third singular form. And when we see vowels alternating, then our two hypotheses are that the vowels are being inserted in the imperative. So there would be insertion of a vowel a in the imperative, or the vowel must be deleted in the first singular and the third singular. This comes down to the question of trying to decide which segments are underlying and which segments are not underlying. That is, again, we'll work mostly with row number 7 here because it's clearest. Is the glottal stop and the a underlying? Is one segment underlying and the other not? Or are these segments being inserted? So to what extent do we need insertion, and to what extent do we require deletion processes? So how do we use the data to try to decide which possibilities are correct? So thus far, we already have underlying representations for 6 of the forms, and let's consider these possibilities of insertion or deletion of vowels and glottal stops in rows 7 through 11 in greater detail. So here we have 4 possibilities. Since row number 7 shows the sequence khayar in all 3 forms, those sounds, the velar fricative, the glide ya, the vowel, and the rhotic khayar, must all be underlying. So if we assume that both sounds are underlying, then we would require processes that insert both a vowel a and a glottal stop at the left edge of the word. And for the third singular, we would need a prefix u, and maybe the same process that inserts a glottal stop at the beginning of a word in the imperative also inserts a glottal stop in the third singular. If we assume that the underlying form has a glottal stop but no vowel a, then we would require a process that inserts a vowel a between the glottal stop and the consonant. In that case, we would have to assume that the third singular is an infix u, right? Because in the third singular form of this word, we have an u occurring between the glottal stop and the consonant. Our fourth hypothesis is that the vowel a is underlying, but the glottal stop is not. In that case, we would need to assume that the underlying vowel a is deleted following another vowel. So remember, we established that the underlying forms of the prefixes must be ni and u. So we would need a process that deletes this underlying vowel a, removes that underlying vowel a when it's preceded by a vowel e or u. And if the glottal stop is not underlying, then we could say that the glottal stop is inserted at the beginning of the word. And again, the prefix for the third singular could simply be u without an underlying glottal stop. And finally, if all 4 of these if both of these segments, the glottal stop and the vowel a, are assumed to be underlying, then we would need to assume that a glottal stop is deleted between vowels. So under this hypothesis, for instance, the first singular form would be ni, ah, yar, and the glottal stop would need to be deleted and then subsequently the a vowel here would have to be deleted as well in order to derive the correct form ni, yar, as we find there. Okay, so how do we tell which of these 4 possibilities is correct at all? Well, I think that option 4, that namely that both the glottal stop and the vowel a are underlying, can be excluded, because we found in rows 5 and 6 there, those glottal stops must be underlying, and in the first singular and third singular forms of those rows, the glottal stop occurs between two vowels and is never deleted. So there can't be any kind of glottal stop deletion process in the language. If we assumed glottal stop deletion, it would incorrectly predict, let's actually see what would happen. If we took row number 6 as an example in its first singular form, if we assumed that there were a process of glottal stop deletion between two vowels, then we should find in row number 6 the first singular form niktuv, which is wrong. Such a form doesn't exist. The first singular form is niaktuv, not niktuv. So there must be some underlying difference then between row number 7 and row number 6. This tells us that the glottal stop that we're seeing at the beginning of row number 7 cannot be underlying. Considering our other options, hypotheses 1 and 2 seem rather improbable because we find 3 different vowels in the first syllable of numbers 7 through 11. But when languages have epenthesis processes that insert vowels, normally they consistently insert the same segment. So if the vowel is not underlying, if the vowel in all of these stems were not underlying, we would expect to see the same vowel here in the first syllable of these words. But we see 3 different vowels, a, I, and u. So that's a good indication that the vowel probably is underlying. So this leads us to then option 3, hypothesis 3, as the best option. Namely, the vowel is underlying, but the glottal stop is not. So under this assumption, the underlying forms for numbers 7 through 11 would all be vowel initial stems. So the underlying forms, let's write these up. They would then be ahyar, iskak. Remember, we see a sh here in the imperative form and the first singular form, but that is due to our process of S palatalization. The underlying form for number 9 would be ik sa. For number 10, it would be isriv. And for number 11, uk sup. So it means there's a contrast between glottal stop initial stems and vowel initial stems. This, in order to operate from these underlying forms, we will then need 2 rules, as already suggested in row number 3. We need a process that will insert a glottal stop at the beginning of a word, and we'll need a process that will delete vowels when 2 vowels are next to each other in order to generate the first singular and the third singular forms. So now let's write our additional phonological rules. So given that we have underlying representations that are vowel initial, it's clear that the stem initial vowel has to be deleted when it's preceded by a vowel in order to generate the first singular and third singular forms, which always have the vowels I and U, which must be part of the underlying representation of those prefixes. So this rule then is fairly simple. It just states that a vowel is deleted if it is preceded by another vowel. So the underlying form for the first singular form of the verb, meaning fill, will be ni ahyar, and vowel hiatus elimination deletes the a, and the third singular form will be u ahyar, and hiatus elimination again deletes the a, giving uhyar. And now, given as we've said that in row 6, we have an underlying glottal stop that always surfaces in both the first singular and the third singular. we require a process that inserts a glottal stop at the beginning of a word. And we can also use that potentially to derive the glottal stop that we consistently see at the beginning of the imperative as well. So glottal stop insertion simply states that a glottal stop is added at the beginning of a word before a vowel. So the underlying form of the stem, meaning achyar, in its imperative form, will have a vowel. Glottal stop insertion will add the glottal stop to give us achyar, as we find. In its first singular form, the underlying a will be deleted by hiatus elimination. In the form of the first singular in row number 6, the verb meaning pluck at, none of the rules apply. Hiatus elimination cannot apply because there's a glottal stop between these two vowels, and there's not a vowel at the beginning of a word. In the underlying form for row number 10, isriv, in the first singular, hiatus elimination in this case deletes an underlying e, giving us nisriv, from underlying ni, isriv, and later s palatalization will give us nishriv, since the s is preceded by an e. In the third singular of the same verb, row number 10, hiatus elimination will delete the e, giving us usriv, and glottal stop insertion will produce usriv. So here we then see this alternation between sh and sa in the paradigm of that verb. And finally, the first singular form of row number 11 shows us the application of both processes once again. So there actually shouldn't be anything on this line that's the same form. We see first hiatus elimination applies, giving us nik sup, the u is deleted, and that allows for s palatalization to apply, giving us nik shu. So this analysis allows us to correctly derive all the forms. And we see that there is then no crucial ordering between glottal stop insertion and s palatalization. Those rules don't interact in any way, but hiatus elimination has to precede s palatalization. And more specifically, hiatus elimination feeds s palatalization, which we see in cases like the last one here. Only because the underlying u was deleted did we obtain the context of an e followed by a single consonant and then an s. So a Hasa diagram for this language would look a bit for Karo based on this would be that we need to have, I'll abbreviate hiatus elimination as HE, and it needs to precede S palatalization. So we see this crucial relation, and otherwise there's no further interaction between those two rules with the glottal stop insertion rule. So the glottal stop insertion rule in the Hasa diagram can just sit alone to the side. It doesn't interact crucially with either of the other rules. Now, I'll make one final remark on the third singular prefix before closing this section. So this prefix u can be derived from underlying u by glottal stop insertion, but we won't obtain any incorrect results if we assume that the glottal stop is underlying. And it's clear, of course, that there are some cases in which glottal stops must be underlying. From the data that we have, we simply cannot know whether the glottal stop of this prefix in the third singular is underlying or not, because it only occurs in word initial context. So in order to know whether that glottal stop in the prefix for the third singular has an underlying glottal stop or not, we would require some additional prefix in order to see what happens. So we could, to make it explicit, what we're thinking about here, let's imagine that we have the third singular form of row number 5, which is underlying the u-ifik. If the language had some further vowel initial prefix, I'll invent a prefix ta. If this glottal stop in the third singular prefix is underlying, then the word would surface as ta-u-ifik. If the glottal stop is not underlying, however, let's consider the other possibility. What would happen? In that case, there would be the context for the application of hiatus elimination, right? Since we now have two vowels next to each other. The u would be deleted, and the result is that we would not see the third singular prefix at all. The resulting form would simply be ta-ifik. So these are questions, hypotheses that we can wonder about, and if we were working on describing the phonology of the Karaok language more extensively, and we were working with native speakers, we would want to try to find some data that helps us decide clearly and definitively whether or not this prefix is underlined. Okay, so much for this analysis of Karaok, and when we return, we will deal with some data from Serbo-Croatian.